The collar was crooked. Sable noticed it before she noticed anything else about the man. Before the height, before the boots, before the cold weight of the whole hall shifting around him like water making room for a stone. She was on her knees when it happened, on the cold stone floor of the north corridor, gathering the broken pieces of a copper pitcher she'd dropped only seconds before. A pitcher that did not belong to her. A pitcher that belonged to Lady Marrow. And Lady Marrow had said that very morning in the flat, and practiced voice she used for things that were not open to discussion, that any object broken under Sable's watch would come out of her wages. Not part of the month, the whole month, all of it. So there she was, kneeling, chasing copper across the floor with fingers that had learned long ago to move fast and stay quiet. Because she was not supposed to be in that corridor. No maid was. The North Wing belonged to the hour of solemn entry, when delegations arrived through the great portal, and no woman in an apron was permitted to be seen on her knees, picking up crockery. The rule existed for exactly this reason, so that a king and his court would never have to step around the people who cleaned their floors. But the pitcher had rolled the wrong way, and Sable had gone after it without thinking which was the mistake, which was always the mistake. Then the procession came. She heard it before she saw it. Heavy boots on stone, a rhythm too even to be anything but trained men walking in formation. Travel cloaks heavy with the dust of long roads, and a smell that arrived before the bodies did. Pine, cured leather, cold earth after rain, and underneath all of it, something older, something that made the back of her neck go tight in a way she couldn't have explained. She did not look up. Maids learn that first before they learn anything else. Do not look up unless someone makes you. Pretend the floor is the whole world. Make yourself small and then smaller until you are a piece of furniture that happens to breathe. Sable had spent 4 years perfecting this. 4 years of folding herself inward until people simply stopped registering her as something worth seeing. It was a skill, a real one. The way some women learned embroidery, she had learned to disappear, and it worked. It always worked. Except one pair of boots stopped. Not all of them. That was the thing that made her blood tick sideways. The rest of the procession kept moving, that steady river of footsteps flowing past her like she was a rock in a stream. But one man stopped. One pair of boots went still, less than a foot from her right knee. Get up, something inside her said. Get up now before he decides you're a problem. She rose too fast. The broken pitcher rattled in her hands, and one shard slipped free and struck the floor with a bright metallic ring that carried the whole length of the corridor. And it was in that exact moment, off balance, startled, stripped of every ounce of the careful composure she'd built over 4 years, that she looked up without meaning to. Because the survival reflex is always faster than manners. And she saw the crooked collar. The man was tall, not the ordinary kind of tall. The kind certain men are where it isn't about height at all, but about the way they take up a room, the way the air seems to rearrange itself to make space for them. He wore a charcoal travel cloak over a dark tunic, fine thread stitched along the neck, and the inner collar had folded outward on the right side. Uneven. Wrong. The kind of detail nobody sees, unless their hands have spent years dressing lords and straightening lapels and smoothing fabric over shoulders that will not hold still. The kind of thing a trained hand finds, the way a musician's ear finds a note gone flat. Sable's hands had been trained to find exactly that, and her hands moved before her mind could stop them. One motion. Automatic. Her right hand rose, her fingers closed gently on the edge of the collar, folded it back into place, laid the left edge over the right, with the exact pressure of a gesture she'd repeated so many times, it had become part of breathing. She felt the fabric settle. Correct, smooth, and then her hand was still in the air, and the silence arrived. It lasted 3 full breaths. She counted them without deciding to the way the mind counts when it refuses to understand what the body has already done. Then she understood. Her blood went cold from the crown of her head, straight down, ice water, finding every path through her at once, because she had just touched him. Not a passing lord, not some minor visiting noble who might sniff and move on. On the chest of that travel cloak was an emblem worked in thread, so fine it nearly vanished into the fabric. A wolf's head, ringed by a crown of iron thorns. She knew that emblem. She'd seen it on banners hung from the eastern walls on state days, on the wax seals of documents that passed through the castle in the hands of breathless messengers, on the shields of guards who'd once ridden through the lower village 3 seasons back, and every soul in that market had gone still and silent until they passed. King Aldrich, ruler of the 5 northern pacts, the man who had bound 3 warring bloodlines together without a single open battle. Through strategy, through dominance, and through a reputation for patience so complete that it frightened people more than fury ever could. Because he was not a king who shouted. He was a king who waited. And every whispered story that had ever drifted down the servant corridors of Greyhold agreed on one thing. It was the waiting that undid you. Her hand was still near his throat. She lowered it. Around her she felt the weight of eyes. Not the polite discomfort of people watching an awkward moment. Something sharper. The calibrated attention of trained wolves, reading a scene for threat, scanning the air, cataloging every detail of the woman on the floor, with broken copper in one hand and her other hand raised toward the throat of their king. Someone behind him made a sound, low in the chest. Not quite a growl, a vibration, the kind that ends somewhere under conscious hearing and wakes something older than thought. Sable didn't look at whoever made it. She kept her eyes down and spoke before the silence could turn into something worse. "Your Majesty," steadier than she had any right to be. "Forgive me. I wasn't watching where I was. I shouldn't be in this corridor. I'll remove myself at once." She took one step back. The collar. His voice stopped her completely. Low, unhurried. The kind of voice that never reaches for volume, because volume is for men who aren't sure they'll be heard. He was sure. The certainty was simply there. The same way the stone walls were there. Not announced. Not argued. Present. It was crooked. Not a question. A fact set down between them like an object placed on a table to be examined. She kept her eyes on the floor. "Yes, Your Majesty." A pause. "How long have you served in this household?" And the wrongness of it landed in her chest. Not the words, the direction of them. Kings arriving for state visits do not stop to ask maids about their years of service. They do not stop at all. The fact that he had the fact that he was still standing there, while an entire delegation waited at his back, meant something she couldn't yet read. 4 years, Your Majesty." She kept her voice flat. Flat voices don't invite more questions. "I came to Greyhold when I was 19. I work under Lady Marrow. I keep the guest chambers in the East Wing, and I assist with formal dressing on ceremonial days." Another silence. Longer. "Your name?" The shards pressed into her palm. She concentrated on that, on the small specific pain of it, because it was solid, because it was something outside the strange floating quiet of the moment. "Sable, your majesty." She heard something shift in the air behind the king. Not movement exactly. A recalibration among the men at his back. A collective adjustment she felt on her skin before she heard it. One of them exhaled. Slow. "Look at me." Every instinct she'd built across 23 years of living at the bottom of every room she'd ever entered rose up at once against those 3 words. Because looking up was dangerous. Making eye contact with power was the fastest way to become visible to it. And visible was the last thing a maid with no family name, no pack, no wolf of consequence, anywhere behind her should ever want to be. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant passing through rooms without a mark keeping her wages, her bed. The narrow, careful little life she'd built around both. But he had not said it like a request. So she looked up. King Aldrich was watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Not cold, not warm, not curious in any way she recognized from the lords and nobles she'd dressed and served and moved around silently for 4 years. His eyes were a gray that reminded her of a mountain sky in late autumn. That flat-held light right before the first snow decides whether or not to fall. I was perhaps 30, perhaps older. It was hard to tell with alphas of old blood who aged the way stone ages, gathering weight instead of years. There was a scar along his jaw, pale, long-healed. It vanished under the edge of his collar. The collar she had straightened without permission. He looked at her steadily. And then, and this was the part she would return to later in the dark of the dormitory, when sleep refused to come, his eyes moved for less than a second to the collar itself. A glance. Almost nothing. "It needed straightening," he said. And then he walked past her. The procession resumed. Boots on stone. The heavy displaced air of large men moving through a narrow space. The smell of pine and cold road fading slowly behind them. The last man paused. She didn't look up this time. She'd learned that much at least in the last 30 seconds. "A word," he said quietly. His voice carried a thread of amusement in it. Fine and deliberate, like a man who'd learned to use humor the way other men use knives. Lightly, with precision. "Next time you reach for a king's collar, you might check the crest on his cloak before your hands move." He did not wait for an answer, and then they were gone. Sable stood in the empty corridor a long time after the last echo faded into the stone, the broken pitcher still in her hands. The cold still climbing through the floor into her knees. The torches burning without sound, indifferent, the way fire always is. Something had happened. She couldn't name it. She couldn't measure it. But she'd spent enough years reading rooms to know when the air in one had changed. And the air in this one had changed quietly without ceremony, the way the first crack appears in river ice in the early days of spring. Invisible from above. Structural. Already deciding the shape of everything that follows. She only knew this. The king had looked at her, and she had not looked away. The East Wing guest chambers took 3 hours to prepare. Sable knew this because she was the one who prepared them. She'd been back behind the kitchens less than 10 minutes long enough to drop the broken copper in the waste bin and say nothing to anyone about where she'd been when Lady Marrow appeared at the end of the passage, like something summoned by the specific frequency of things going wrong. She was a tall woman, Angular in the way certain people become angular when authority has lived in the body long enough. All sharp lines and compressed impatience, gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to be holding her whole face in place. The North Chambers. No greeting. Lady Marrow rarely bothered with those. The king's personal staff needs 4 rooms on the upper level. The king himself takes the ironwood chamber. You'll prepare it. Sable looked at her. The ironwood chamber is the largest guest room in the castle. She chose her words carefully. Lord Greyhold's steward, usually. Lord Greyhold's steward is managing the great hall for tonight's reception. Lady Marrow's eyes moved over her with the efficiency of a woman assessing a tool rather than a person. You know that chamber better than anyone. You cleaned it for the last 3 state visits. You'll do it now, and you'll do it without incident. A pause, sharp as a pin pushed into cloth. I'm told there was an incident in the North Corridor this afternoon. The air in the passage went very still. I dropped a pitcher, Sable said. I picked up the pieces. No damage to the floor. Lady Marrow looked at her a moment longer than she needed to. See that dropping things is the worst of it, she said, and turned away. The ironwood chamber sat on the uppermost level of the east wing at the end of a corridor lined with narrow windows that looked out over the forest. In the gray light of late afternoon, the trees beyond the glass were the color of iron, and the sky above them the color of old pewter, and the whole landscape had the look of something holding its breath. Sable had never quite known how to read that room. It was the finest in Greyhold. That much was plain. The carved bed frame, the tapestries of old hunts in deep red and green, the fireplace large enough to stand inside, the writing desk of actual ironwood that gave the room its name, worth more than everything Sable owned put together. And yet, there was something in the proportions of it. The ceiling a little too high, the windows a little too narrow, something that made it feel less like a room built for comfort and more like a room built for thinking, for weighing things, the architecture of a place where powerful men came to decide. She built the fire first because the stone held cold like a living thing, and the delegation had ridden 4 days out of mountain weather. Then the bed linens, the coverlet smoothed, the candles checked in their iron holders along the walls. She filled the basin from the heated pail she'd carried up from the kitchens, set out fresh cloth, arranged a small table near the fire with a carafe of dark wine and 2 clean cups. She was adjusting the carafe, nudging it left so it would catch the firelight and look less stark against the bare wood. When she realized she was not alone, she didn't hear anyone come in. That was the first thing that registered. The door hadn't opened, the floorboards hadn't shifted, but the quality of the air in the room had changed, and she'd been around wolves long enough to know what that change meant before her other senses caught up. She turned. There were 2 of them. They'd come in through the side door, the narrow servants' entrance in the far wall, the one she'd left unlatched for her own use, and in the fog of the afternoon, forgotten to lock behind her. They were not the king. She knew that at once. They were young, both of them. Mid-20s, maybe. In the dark leather and wool of the king's personal guard, the iron thorn worked into the clasps at their shoulders. One leaned against the wall near the servants' door, arms folded, watching her with the look of a man who'd been waiting longer than he'd have liked. The other stood closer by the writing desk, running one finger along the ironwood grain like he found it genuinely interesting. The maid from the corridor. The one by the desk. The amused one. She knew his voice at once, that same fine thread of deliberate humor. Up close, he was sharp-featured, dark-haired, with the kind of face that would have been handsome if it ever stayed serious, which it clearly did not. "I told Torvald you'd be the one they sent up here. He didn't believe me." The one against the wall. Torvald apparently said nothing. Broader than the first, quieter in every sense. Pale eyes that moved over the room and over Sable the same systematic way. Cataloging, not commenting. "I'm preparing the chamber," Sable said. Level. "If you're part of the king's staff, I can finish and leave, so you may. We're not here for the chamber." The dark-haired one pulled his finger from the desk and straightened. "We're here because the king's beta is standing outside that door." He gestured toward the main entrance. "And he's decided, in his considerable wisdom, that you shouldn't be in this room when the king arrives." Sable looked at the main door, then back at him. The beta. She kept her face still. "Armed," Halden Torvald said from the wall. First word he'd spoken. He said it the way a man provides a relevant fact. "Don't walk into the storm." She stared at him. "I beg your pardon. It's a saying." The dark-haired one waved a hand. "It means the situation outside that door is a good deal less welcoming than the one in here." Halden takes his post seriously. He has opinions about who occupies rooms before the king does, and those opinions are, he searched for the word, firm. "I was assigned to this room by Lady Marrow," Sable said, "and Halden was assigned to that door by the king. The interesting question," he tilted his head, "is which assignment carries more weight." From beyond the main door came footsteps, measured, deliberate. They stopped directly outside. Then a voice, low, clipped, carrying that particular texture of authority exercised so long it becomes a physical thing. The chamber should be clear, and Sable understood with cold and specific clarity that she was now caught between a beta who did not want her in the room and a servant's door guarded by two men who found the whole thing entertaining. So, she picked up the empty pail, smoothed her apron, turned toward the servant's door with all the composure she had, which at that particular moment was less than she'd have liked, but more than nothing. "Excuse me," she said to the dark-haired one. He stepped aside with a small, almost imperceptible incline of the head that seemed beneath the amusement genuine, which surprised her. She was 2 steps from the servant's door when it opened from the other side. King Aldrich walked in. He'd changed out of the travel cloak. A simpler tunic, now dark, no embroidery. His hair damp at the temples like he'd just washed the road off his face. In this context, without the procession and the weight of the assembled court, he looked almost like a man rather than an institution. Almost. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. Behind her, the main door opened, and she heard the beta enter. Halden, the armed one, the one who'd decided she should not be here. She felt his attention land on her back like a flat hand pressed between her shoulder blades. She was finishing the room, the dark-haired guard offered from somewhere to her left, in the tone of a man supplying context before anyone thinks to ask. King Aldrich looked at the room, at the fire built and burning well, at the bed turned back correctly, at the wine carafe catching the firelight. He looked at these things with the same quality of attention she'd noticed in the corridor. Thorough, unhurried, the attention of a man who's trained himself to see things as they are, rather than as he expects them to be. Then he looked at Sable. "The collar was straight this morning," he said. "Now the room is ready." It was not quite gratitude. It was not quite anything she had a word for. It landed somewhere between observation and acknowledgement in a register she had never once heard a man of his standing use with her in 4 years. She managed a small, correct curtsy, the pail still in her hand. "Good evening, Your Majesty," and she walked out through the servants' door. Just before it closed, she heard the dark-haired guard say something low that she couldn't make out. And then, quieter still, barely carrying through the wood, a sound that might have been the beginning of something almost like a laugh. From a man whose face she was fairly certain very rarely made that sound at all. The reception that evening filled the great hall with the kind of noise that has weight to it. Sable heard it from the servants' corridor along the eastern wall. A narrow passage behind the tapestries where maids moved during formal events, like shadows behind a lit curtain, carrying trays, refilling carafes, making themselves useful without making themselves seen. The sound came through the stone in waves, voices over voices. The deep resonance of wolf lords gathered, the occasional sharp ring of a cup against a table. Music from the gallery playing something old and ceremonial that no one was actually listening to. She'd been assigned to corridor service for the night. Lady Marrow's decision delivered without explanation, which meant either punishment for the pitcher or something else. With Lady Marrow, it was usually both. She was not supposed to look through the gaps in the tapestries. She looked through the gaps in the tapestries. Aldrich sat at the high table. She found him before she found anything else, which she noted and filed away in the category of things she would not examine too closely. He sat between Lord Greyhold, the castle's aging lord, broad and red-faced, and talking with the determined energy of a man covering nerves and an empty chair. A chair placed with deliberate spacing. The kind of spacing that announces someone's absence louder than their presence ever could. It was Odalis who found her an hour into it. Odalis was the only person in Greyhold who had known Sable before Greyhold, before the 4 years of quiet service, before the corner bed, and the copper pitchers, and the careful, invisible life. They'd grown up in the same village at the edge of the eastern foothills, the kind of village that doesn't appear on formal maps, but exists anyway, full of humans and low-blood wolves, and the various people who never fit the tidy hierarchies of the larger territories. Odalis had come to the castle 2 years after Sable down the same narrow road of necessity. She worked the laundry, and she was the one person to whom Sable never had to explain the meaning underneath a thing. "You have the face," Odalis said, falling into step beside her in the passage. "The one you get when you're doing arithmetic nobody asked for." "I'm fine. You're fine the way the castle well is fine in winter. Working. Cold. Nobody wants to look too close at what's at the bottom." Sable said nothing. Odalis glanced at her sideways, small brown-haired with an unnervingly accurate instinct for when Sable was carrying something alone that she shouldn't be. "I heard about the corridor." Everyone heard about the corridor. "The maid who touched the king." A pause. "Which is not for the record," put it. But Hetty from the East Kitchens told Brenna, and Brenna told the world. I straightened his collar. "I know what you did. I'm telling you what it became by the time it reached the laundry." Odalis stopped walking, turned to face her properly. "Sable, what's actually happening?" And Sable told her. Not all of it. Not the way the air had changed. Not the thing she couldn't name. But the procession, the collar, the ironwood chamber, the dark-haired guard. She told it in order flat the way she told Odalis things when she needed the outside eyes of someone who wouldn't dramatize. Odalis listened without interrupting. One of her best qualities. When Sable finished, Odalis was quiet a moment. "There's a woman," she said finally. "Came with the Greyhold party from the Southern Holdings. Arrived 2 days before the delegation. Lady Aldrich." Her voice went careful. Her son is Roderick. He's been positioned as a match for one of the Northern Alliance seats for the last 8 months. That empty chair at the high table tonight. The one placed like a hole in the room. That one. Odalis held her gaze. The whole visit was arranged around a specific set of alliance terms. And the king arrived and started declining things before the first meal was served. People are trying to understand why. A beat. And then a maid touched his collar, and he stopped to ask her name. "It has nothing to do with me," Sable said. Odalis didn't answer, which was in its own way a kind of answer. It was on her 4th pass through the corridor that she heard her own name, not loud, not the flat efficiency of a task being assigned, which was how her name was usually spoken in this castle. It came through a gap in the tapestry from somewhere near the side entrance of the hall. 2 voices at a register they clearly believed was private, which it would have been. For anyone standing more than a few feet off, Sable was standing 3 feet off. She'd stopped because the tray had gone slightly uneven, and she was correcting it. The girl from the corridor. A woman's voice. High. Dry. The particular precision of someone used to being overheard by people who don't matter. She put her hands on him. She adjusted his collar. A man. Older. The measured cadence of a castle official, hardly the same thing. In full view of the delegation. Without permission. Without rank or standing of any kind. A pause. And in the pause, something trying to present itself as concern. She has no pack, no family of note, no standing in any of the 5 territories. Whatever interest she caught this afternoon, it should be discouraged, before it settles into something inconvenient. Inconvenient. Sable stood very still, because she was not, as a rule, a woman who let herself feel anger. Anger was expensive. It cost more than it ever returned, especially for someone in her position, and she'd learned early that the feelings you could least afford were the ones most easily provoked. But there was something about hearing herself described that way. Not as a person, not even as someone who'd done an actual wrong, but as a small problem to be managed, discouraged, settled before it could grow. It moved through her like heat through iron. She adjusted the tray, straightened her back, walked. She'd covered maybe 10 feet of corridor when the tapestry to her left shifted. Not a gap. The whole panel pushed from the hall side, and the dark-haired guard stepped through it with the ease of a man who had located the servants' corridor some time ago and found the discovery useful. He looked at her, then at her face. Then he tilted his head, and the amusement in his expression adjusted into something more attentive. "You heard something unpleasant?" Not a question. "I'm working," Sable said. "You're working, and you heard something unpleasant." He fell into step beside her, which she had not invited, and which he clearly did not require an invitation for. "The acoustics in this hall are treacherous. I speak from experience. I once heard a very detailed account of my own table manners from 40 feet away." A beat. The account was accurate, which made it worse. And despite everything, something in her chest loosened. She did not smile, but the impulse was there. "Your name," she said, because she was tired of thinking of him as the dark-haired guard. "Corwin." He gave a small bow that was mostly mockery of a bow. "Advisor to the king," which mostly means I say things in rooms where saying them directly would be impolitic. He glanced at her tray. "And you're Sable, who straightens collars and hears things through walls. We're both in our own ways working the margins of important rooms." She looked at him sideways. That's a generous way to describe the distance between an advisor to a king and a maid carrying wine. Generous, also accurate. He stopped when they reached the junction where the servants' corridor branched toward the kitchens, and the humor left his face entirely, which she had not yet seen happen. The woman who was speaking, you should know her concern isn't about propriety. Sable looked at him. She's the mother of the man Lord Greyhold meant to seat beside the king tonight. That empty chair was for her son. The king declined the arrangement. Corwin's voice was quiet now, direct without apology. She's not worried you broke a rule. She's worried you're the reason the seat stayed empty. That's absurd, Sable said. He stopped to ask my name. That's all. I know. Corwin looked at her a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that she couldn't read. Do you want to know what's strange about that? She didn't answer, which he took as yes. He hasn't asked about anyone in 4 years. A pause. Not since his mate died. The corridor was cold and quiet. The noise of the hall carried on behind the fabric as though nothing at all had shifted. Sable stood very still. 4 years, she said. Slowly. You're telling me a king stopped for 4 years, and then stopped again. For a collar. I'm telling you, Corwin said, that it was never about the collar. And there it was. The thing she hadn't been able to name in the corridor that afternoon. The change in the air. The fracture in the ice. He'd said it out loud, and now she couldn't unhear it. He notices, Corwin went on softer, when people look at him like a throne. It's the only kind of looking he's had in 4 years. Lords who want things. Ladies who want seats. Men who bow so low they never once see his face. A pause. You looked at him like a man with a crooked collar. Do you understand? You saw something wrong, and you fixed it without thinking, without wanting anything back. He hasn't been seen like that since he buried her. I'm a maid, Sable said, and her own voice sounded strange to her. I fix things. It's the only thing I know how to do. Yes. Corwin's mouth curved gentle, now none of the earlier blade in it. I know. He went back through the tapestry, and Sable stood at the junction, the tray balanced in her hands, the cold coming up through the stone. And then she heard it. From somewhere above and behind her. From the direction of the passage that connected the servants' corridor to the upper gallery. A sound that did not belong. Quiet, deliberate, the specific quality of someone standing in an elevated place being very still. She did not look up, but she knew with the wordless certainty of a body that has learned to read spaces for safety that someone was there, and that whoever stood in that gallery above the servants' corridor in the dark had been there longer than the moment she'd noticed, long enough maybe to have heard all of it. The scent of pine and cold road. Faint, but there, where no delegation had any reason to be. She walked toward the kitchen passage. Behind her, she heard nothing, but the air had that quality again. The one from the corridor that afternoon. The one she still did not have a name for. The quality of something that has already chosen its direction. Moving forward the way rivers move forward. Not because anyone asked, but because the shape of the land allows for nothing else. She did not look back, and she did not yet know, could not have known, standing there with the cold in her hands, that the man in the gallery had come to Greyhold to sign away his freedom to an alliance he did not want. That the empty chair was only the beginning of what he intended to refuse, and that 4 years of waiting had that very afternoon in a narrow corridor over a piece of copper on the floor finally found the thing it had been waiting for. She only knew this. The king had looked at her, and she had not looked away. The morning after a state reception at Greyhold began the way every morning began. With the bells from the North Tower marking the 5th hour, and every maid in the dormitory rising before the 6th, Sable was already awake when the bells rang. She had not slept well, not out of distress exactly, but out of that particular restlessness that comes when the mind has gathered more than it's had time to sort. She lay in the narrow bed in the corner she'd occupied for 4 years, close to the window, because she preferred cold air to the stuffiness of the middle of the room. And she went through the shape of things methodically, the way she always did when something needed understanding. The king had looked at her twice. Corwin had sought her out to tell her a thing he hadn't been asked to tell her. Someone had stood in the upper gallery in the dark and said nothing, and gone unnoticed by everyone except her. And a woman whose face she now knew had described her to a castle official as a problem, to be discouraged, before it settled into something. She sorted these facts the way she sorted linen, by weight, by category, by what each was likely to mean in practical terms. The first 2 were strange but not yet dangerous. The third she couldn't fully read. The fourth was the one that needed watching. Because in Sable's experience, being called an inconvenience by someone with influence was the kind of thing that moved from words to action with very little warning. She dressed in the dark and went to work. The first task of the morning was the guest chambers. Freshwater clean linens and the king's rooms attended before he woke, which meant before the 6th bell. She moved through the upper east wing with her cart. Linens, 2 heated pails, fresh cloth, candles, and worked her way from the smaller rooms toward the ironwood chamber at the end. The other rooms were simple, in and out in minutes. The staff still sleeping or already gone to the dawn briefings large delegations always held. Outside the ironwood chamber, she stopped. The door stood slightly open. Not much, barely the width of 2 fingers, but enough to tell her the room was occupied and the occupant awake, which meant she should not go in, which meant she should set the linens on the bench beside the door and come back later. She set the folded linens down, and she heard it. Voices, low, from inside, not conversation, something more directed, the clipped rhythm of a briefing. She recognized Halden's voice, the beta-flat and precise, and beneath it, Aldrich's asking a question she couldn't quite catch. She should have walked away. She heard her own name, not loud, not with emphasis, just placed into the sentence the way a name is placed when it's already part of the subject and needs no introduction. Sable, the maid from the corridor, Lady Marrow's staff, and then Aldrich's reply, which she couldn't make out, and then Holden again, with the measured disapproval of a man reporting an assessment he'd already finished. No pack, no recorded bloodline, no standing in any of the 5 territories. A pause. Then Aldrich. And this she heard clearly because he'd moved closer to the door. Then find out where she comes from. Not who she is, not what she wants, where she comes from. 2 words landed in her chest and stayed there, followed by silence. And then the briefing resumed about something else entirely. Supply routes, meeting schedules, the logistics of the day. Sable stood in the corridor with the empty cart. Where she comes from. She didn't know what to do with that, because she came from nowhere, from a village that wasn't on any map, from a dead mother and a road walked alone at 19. There was nothing to find, except something in the way he'd said it. Not curiosity, not suspicion, something quieter, like a man confirming a thing he already half believed. She picked up the cart and walked. Odalis found her at the linen press an hour later. She took the other handle without being asked, which was how Odalis said, "I know something's wrong," without wasting words on it. "You've got the arithmetic face again," she said. "He asked where I come from." Odalis's hands stilled on the press. "Who did?" "The king, this morning, through a door I shouldn't have been standing at." Sable folded a sheet with more force than folding a sheet required. "He told his beta to find out where I come from." Odalis was quiet a moment, and then she did something Sable didn't expect. She sat down, on the edge of the low bench by the press, slowly, like a woman whose legs had decided the matter for her. "Sable," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not fold linen while I do it." Sable set the sheet down, because there was a tone in Odalis's voice she'd only heard once before. Years ago, in the village, on the night Odalis's father didn't come home from the hills. "When we were girls," Odalis began, "you never asked why you lived with the widow Anselm and not with kin. You never asked why she moved you twice before you were 10. You never asked why she burned the letters that came for you." A breath. "You never asked, because you learned early that asking made her afraid. And a frightened guardian is a dangerous thing to live beside." Odalis, let me finish, because I've carried this since we were 14, and I swore I never would, and I'm about to break that oath in a laundry of all the stupid places. Odalis looked up at her. "Your mother wasn't nobody. Your mother was a healer, not a village herb woman. A pack healer. She served the bloodline of the Hollow Vale Wolves." The name meant nothing to Sable, and then it meant something. A cold thing. A story told to frighten children. "The Hollow Vale packs were destroyed," Sable said slowly, "before I was born. Wiped out in a single winter. Everyone knows that. It's a fireside story." "It's not a story." Odalis's voice was very steady now, the steadiness of a woman finally setting down a stone she'd carried too long. "It happened, and your mother survived it. She ran carrying you. She came to our foothills because no one there knew a Hollow Vale face from any other. And she died when you were 3, and the widow Anselm took you. And the widow Anselm spent the rest of her life terrified that someone would come looking. Not for you as a person, for you as a thread, the last one, of a bloodline someone once decided had to end." The laundry was very quiet, steam rising off the press, the distant sound of the castle waking above them. "That's why she moved you," Odalis said. "That's why she burned the letters. That's why you were taught, before you were taught anything else, to make yourself invisible. It wasn't a maid's skill, Sable. It was a survival she put in you, before you could even remember learning it." Sable's blood had gone cold, but not the ice-water cold of the corridor. A different cold. The cold of a floor giving way beneath a foot that had stood on it for 23 years, certain it was solid ground. Where she comes from. "He knows," she whispered. "Somehow, he knows something." "He's a wolf of old blood," Odalis said gently. "And you carry a scent that hasn't walked the 5 territories in 20 years. He may not know what he's smelling, but he knows it's rare, and rare to men like that is worth stopping for." Sable pressed a hand flat against the press, the wood warm under her palm, something solid to hold while the ground moved. "Who else knows?" "No one living," Odalis said. "The widow's dead. My mother's dead. It was 2 frightened women and a secret. Now it's you and me. A pause. And whatever the king's nose has started to guess. And Sable understood, standing there in the steam that the invisible life she'd built with such care, brick by careful brick over 23 years, had never been a life at all. It had been a hiding place. And someone had just opened the door. She met Roderick Aldrich for the first time that afternoon, and she understood at once why the empty chair at the high table had carried the specific weight of announced absence. I was the kind of man who expected to be noticed. Tall, well-dressed, groomed with the confidence of someone told since childhood that rooms should arrange themselves around his arrival. Perhaps 28, with the build of a trained wolf and the face of a man who'd never once been seriously refused anything. I was standing in the corridor outside the ironwood chamber when she came around the corner with fresh candles. And he was not alone. 2 of his own men flanked him, and he was looking at the king's door with an attention that wasn't quite a stare, but wasn't casual either. He noticed her at 6 feet. His eyes moved over her with the unhurried assessment of a man who doesn't trouble to hide that he's assessing. And then something shifted. Not interest, not attraction. The sharper, specific attention of recognition. He'd heard about the corridor. She could see it. The way his gaze recalibrated from dismissal into something calculating. "You're the maid," he said. "I work in this wing, my lord." She kept walking. "I heard you made quite an impression yesterday." His voice followed her, pitched at the exact volume of a man performing for the men beside him. Loud enough for them to hear, quiet enough to seem private. Interesting approach for someone in your position. She stopped. She should not have stopped. But the phrasing "someone in your position" landed in the same place the woman's voice through the tapestry had landed the night before, in the part of her that had spent 23 years absorbing that register of dismissal, and had somewhere in the last 2 days begun to absorb it less gracefully than usual. She turned. "I was doing my work, my lord." Even, correct, every inflection placed exactly. "As I'm doing now." He looked at her with an expression that was almost amused, but not the way Corwin was amused. This was the amusement of a man who's found a small, unexpected resistance in a thing that should have been soft. "Of course," he said, and then, quieter, stepping half a pace closer, low enough now that his men wouldn't catch it. "Here's a thought for you, girl. Kings don't collect strays. They notice them. They amuse themselves. And then they ride home, and the stray gets left in the mud she was standing in. Whatever you think happened in that corridor, it didn't. Save yourself the fall." And there was something underneath the cruelty. Something that made the hair rise on her arms. Because it wasn't idle. It wasn't a man being petty. It was a man managing something. A man who had already decided she was a piece to be moved off the board. Exactly as his mother had. She turned back and walked. She kept her pace exactly steady, because changing it would tell him something she wasn't prepared to give. She was 3 steps from the turn when a door opened. Not the ironwood chamber's main door. The servant's entrance in the side wall. Torvald stepped out. He stood in the corridor with the stillness she'd already come to know. His pale eyes moving from Sable to Roderick to the 2 men in the slow, systematic way of a man completing an assessment that had already produced its conclusion. He said nothing, but he did not go back through the door either. He simply stood there, and the quality of his stand, the weight of it, the absolute absence of uncertainty in it, changed the texture of the corridor entirely. Roderick's expression shifted. Barely. But she saw it. After a moment, Roderick turned and walked the other way, his men following. The sound of their boots faded around the far corner. Torvald looked at Sable. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said quietly. I gave a single minimal nod. And then, just as he turned to go, he spoke, which she had not expected, because Torvald did not, as a rule, spend words. "That one," he said with a slight tilt of his head toward where Roderick had gone. "Watch his hands, not his mouth." And he went back through the servant's door. Sable stood in the corridor with the candles in her hands, turning that over. Watch his hands, not his mouth. A warning she didn't fully understand yet. She would. It happened 3 days later, on the last full day of the state visit. The delegation was to leave the following dawn, which meant the final Alliance Assembly was set for that afternoon, and the formal signing to follow it. The whole castle moved at a different frequency. Faster, tighter. The way a household moves when something is about to be decided in the rooms above. Sable was assigned to the great hall. Fresh candles. The long tables cleared. A single formal table set at the center, documents laid in the middle, wax seals intact. She was replacing a burned-down candle near the far wall when Lady Marrow came for her, and she knew the moment she saw the woman's face that something had gone wrong, because Lady Marrow did not walk fast. In 4 years, Sable had never once seen her walk fast, and she was walking fast, now gray hair pulled tight, 2 of the castle guard behind her, and her expression was not impatience. It was fear, carefully controlled, but fear. "Come with me," Lady Marrow said. "My lady, I'm not finished with the now." They took her to the steward's office, and on the steward's desk lay a set of documents. The alliance terms, the ones meant to be signed that afternoon, their wax seals broken, 2 pages missing, and a 3rd page altered. Words scraped away and rewritten in a different hand. And beside the documents, folded, tucked into a cloth that Sable recognized because it was the cloth she used to polish the candle holders. Her cloth, from her cart. "These were found in your quarters," Lady Marrow said. Her voice flat, but Sable could hear the strain beneath it. "In the linen chest at the foot of your bed." "That's not," Sable started. "The northern seal is broken." Lady Marrow spoke over her. Fast, like a woman trying to get through a thing before it got worse. Alliance documents tampered with, hidden by a maid with no pack and no bloodline on the eve of a signing. The Southern Party opposed. "Do you understand what this looks like? Do you understand what they will say?" And Sable understood. It looked like espionage. It looked like a nameless girl planted in the castle, working against the very alliance the king had come to weigh. It had a shape. A clean, terrible shape. The kind of shape that men build to fit a person they've already decided to be rid of. Watch his hands, not his mouth. "Lady Aldrich," Sable said, quietly. "Or her son. They did this. Do not." Lady Marrow's voice dropped to almost nothing. "Do not say that name in this room. You have no proof. You have no standing. You have a cloth from your own cart, wrapped around treason, and you have a lord of the Southern Holdings who will stand in that hall this afternoon and swear he saw you near the steward's office 3 nights running." A pause. "Did you go near the steward's office 3 nights running?" And Sable's blood went cold. Because she had. Passing through on her way to the ironwood chamber. Every night of the visit, which anyone watching would have seen, which someone had been watching for. Watch his hands. "I want to see the king," Sable said. Lady Marrow laughed, short and bitter, and entirely without humor. "The king is in council. The king is signing an alliance in 4 hours. The king cannot be interrupted by a maid accused of the very crime he's here to guard against." She stepped closer, and for just a moment, the hardness in her face cracked, and something almost like sorrow showed through it. "Girl, listen to me. I have run this house for 20 years. I know how these things go. If you stay there will be a tribunal, and a tribunal takes a name and a bloodline to speak for it, and you have neither. They will not exile you. Do you understand me? They will not simply send you away." She let that sit. "Go, tonight, before the assembly. Take the eastern gate. I'll see it's unwatched for 1 hour after the 9th bell. It's the only mercy I have to give you, and I'm giving it against my own interest." And Sable understood what she was being told. Run, or die. She didn't see him again. That was the part that would stay with her longest in the weeks that followed. Not the accusation, not the broken seals, not the cloth from her own cart, but that she left Greyhold without seeing the king one more time. Because some small foolish part of her, the part she'd have denied to her own reflection, had believed, had let itself believe for 3 days, that the man in the gallery, the man who asked where she came from, the man who saw a woman with a crooked collar instead of a throne would come, would stand between her and the shape they'd built to destroy her. He did not come. She learned later that no one told him, that Lady Aldrich had timed it precisely. The accusation delivered while the king sat in the sealed council chamber, the tribunal to be convened after the signing when the alliance was done, and a nameless maid was too small a matter to unsettle it. But Sable didn't know that yet. That night, she knew only this, that she gathered everything she owned into a single cloth bag, which took less time than it should take to pack a life. That she waited for the 9th bell. That the eastern gate stood unwatched exactly as Lady Marrow had promised one small mercy in a castle full of none. And that she walked out into the cold, down the road toward the lower village, and did not let herself look back at the tower where the light of the council chamber still burned. She walked until the castle was gone, behind the shoulder of the hill. And then, only then, she stopped, and sat down at the edge of the road on a cold stone, the cloth bag in her lap. And she did not cry, because crying was a thing you did when you had the luxury of it, and she did not. She had a night and a cold road, and 100 miles of nowhere in front of her. But she sat, and she let herself feel it. Once. For exactly as long as she'd let herself feel the anger in the corridor. No longer, because for 3 days she had been seen. For the first time in 23 years, someone had looked at her and not looked away. A king had stopped. An advisor had crossed a hall to tell her the truth. A silent guard had stood in a corridor and made a lord retreat. She had been for 3 days a person in a room instead of a shadow behind a curtain. And now, back to the mud, exactly where Roderick said she'd end. Kings don't collect strays. She sat on the cold stone, the stars sharp and indifferent overhead, and she thought with a bitterness that surprised her, he was right. The cruel man was right, and the kind ones let it happen. Except something snagged. Some small thing at the very edge of her mind, the way a thread catches on a nail and you don't notice until it pulls. The seals. She sat up straight, because she had seen the documents. on the steward's desk. For only a moment, but she had seen them, and Sable did not see things the way other people saw things. She had spent 4 years training her eyes to find the one detail out of place. The crooked collar. The candle burned unevenly. The carafe that caught the light wrong. And there had been something wrong with the seal, the northern seal, the broken one, the iron thorn crown pressed into red wax. She'd seen that seal 100 times, on documents that passed through the castle, on the king's own cloak. She knew its shape the way she knew her own hands, and the wax on that document. The thorns had been wrong, too even, too clean. The real iron thorn seal had a flaw in it, a tiny break in the third thorn on the left side, where the die had chipped years ago. Every genuine northern seal in the 5 territories carried that flaw. She knew because she'd handled hundreds of them, because a maid who dresses lords also carries their letters. And she had noticed the chipped thorn the way she noticed everything without meaning to filing it away for no reason at all. The seal on that document had no flaw, which meant it was not the king's seal, which meant someone had made a copy. A false die, cut to look like the northern seal, but cut by someone who had never held the real thing closely enough to see the chip, which meant watch his hands, not his mouth. Sable was on her feet, the cold forgotten, the bag forgotten, her heart going hard against her ribs, because she couldn't prove it. Not from a stone at the side of a road. She had a memory of a chip in a seal, and no seal to show, and no standing to be believed, and a castle full of people who had already decided what she was. But she knew. And knowing was the first thing. Knowing was the crack in the ice. She had spent her whole life making herself small enough to survive, folding inward, disappearing. Because the widow Anselm had put that survival in her before she could remember learning it, and she had built an entire life on the single principle that the safest thing a person like her could do was to not be seen. And it had not saved her. In the end, invisibility had not saved her at all. It had made her the perfect person to blame. No pack to defend her. No name to speak for her. No one to notice when she vanished. So there was nothing left to lose by being seen. Sable stood at the edge of the road in the cold under the sharp stars, and she made a decision that the widow Anselm would have been terrified to watch her make. She was not going to run. She was going to turn around. And she was 3 steps back up the road toward the castle when a shape detached itself from the dark ahead of her. Broad. Still. Familiar. Torvald. He stood in the middle of the road as though he'd been waiting. As though he'd known with that same wordless certainty she was only now learning to trust in herself exactly which way she would walk once she'd had time to think. He did not explain how he'd found her. He did not explain why he'd come. He simply looked at her in the dark on the empty road, and he reached into his coat and held something out. A small disc of red wax, broken clean in half. "This fell from the false document," Torvald said, his voice low, even. "When they carried it to the steward's office." A pause. "It isn't ours." Sable looked at the wax in his open hand, and then up at his face. "The third thorn," she said, "on the left." Something moved in Torvald's pale eyes, something that might in a less careful man have been surprise. "You saw it too," he said. "I see everything," Sable said. And for the first time in 23 years, she said it not as a confession, but as a weapon. Torvald closed his hand around the wax, And he looked at her, this silent man, who spent words the way a miser spends coin, and he said the longest thing she had ever heard him say. "They've called a tribunal for midday. Tomorrow, not this afternoon." He watched her take that in. "The lady moved it. She wants you condemned while you're gone, and the seat confirmed, and the whole thing sealed before the king thinks to ask a single question. Delaying it past the signing was meant to keep it small. But she moved it up the moment they found the documents, because a fast verdict on an absent woman is the cleanest verdict there is." A pause. "She's counting on you being halfway to nowhere by dawn. The cold road, the sharp stars, the broken wax in a silent man's fist. Then let's disappoint her," Sable said, and she turned, back toward the castle, back toward the tower where the light still burned, back toward every person who had already decided what she was, walking for the first time in her life toward the thing she was afraid of, instead of away. They came back through the eastern gate an hour before dawn, the same gate Sable had walked out of, unwatched, still exactly as Lady Marrow had left it, which struck Sable as its own small irony, that the mercy meant to help her disappear was now the door she used to return. Torvald did not take her to the great hall. He took her to the laundry, because the laundry, he said, was the one room in Greyhold where no lord ever set foot, and where a maid arriving before the 5th bell would surprise no one at all. Odalis was already awake. She took one look at Sable, standing in the doorway, in a traveling cloak with a cloth bag still in her hand, and a silent guard at her shoulder. And she set down the sheet she was folding, and she said only one thing. "I knew you'd come back." A breath. "I didn't know whether to be glad or terrified." "Both," Sable said. "Be both. It's the accurate answer." And then in the steam and the gray light with the castle, waking overhead, the three of them built the thing that would either save her or finish her. Because a broken seal was not enough. Sable understood that. A chip in a thorn, a half-disc of red wax, the word of a silent guard, and a maid with no name. It would not be enough. Not against a lady of the southern holdings, and a son with a bloodline, and a shape already built to fit. They needed the die, the false one, the copy of the northern seal, cut by someone who'd never held the real thing close enough to see the flaw. Because a false document could be dismissed as a plant, but a false seal found in the possession of the people who'd made it was a thing no tribunal could look away from. "It'll be with Roderick," Torvald said, "or his mother. Close. They wouldn't trust it to a servant, and they wouldn't destroy it yet. Not until the maid is condemned and the seat is filled. A man like that keeps his tools until the work is done." "So we find it," Sable said. "So we find it." Odalis agreed. "In 6 hours, in a castle of 100 rooms, guarded by men who'd kill you for being in the wrong corridor." She paused. "Is now a bad time to mention this is insane?" "It's the correct time," Sable said. "Note it, and keep going." And here was the thing Sable understood that Roderick had never once considered that Lady Aldrich, in all her careful planning, had failed to account for. She knew this castle. Not the way a lord knows a castle, which is to say, the great hall, and the guest wings, and the rooms where important men sit. She knew it the way the people who clean it know it. The servants' passages behind the walls, the unlatched doors, the order in which rooms were tended, and by whom, and when. She knew that Lady Aldrich had been given the blue chamber on the second landing. She knew that the blue chamber was cleaned each morning at the 6th bell by a girl named Pell, who was 17 and slow and frightened of everything. And she knew that no one, not one lord in that entire castle, ever noticed the maid who came to lay their fire. Sable laid Lady Aldrith's fire at the 6th bell, in Pell's apron, with Pell's cart, her head down, her presence folded inward her whole body, compressed into the shape of a thing not worth looking at. The skill the widow Anselm had put in her before she could remember learning it. The skill that had failed to save her. Except now she understood what it was actually for. Not to hide. To move. To pass through a room full of dangerous people and have them look straight through her as though she were furniture that happened to breathe. 23 years of learning to be invisible. And she had spent all of it believing the skill was a cage. It was a key. Lady Aldrith was at her mirror when Sable came in. Roderick stood by the window, dressed already for the tribunal that groomed confidence sitting on him like a second coat. Neither of them looked at her. Why would they? A maid, laying a fire. On the morning of their triumph, condemned in absentia, the seat confirmed by nightfall, Lady Aldrith was saying to her own reflection in the dry, precise voice Sable had first heard through a tapestry. And by the time the king thinks to ask about a missing maid, we'll be halfway home with a northern council seat, and no one left alive who cares. You're certain she ran, Roderick said. Marrow left the gate open. The little fool will have taken it. They always take it. Fear is the most reliable thing about people with nothing. A pause. Where's the die? And Sable, kneeling at the cold hearth with her head down, went very still. Roderick crossed to the writing desk, opened a drawer, and took out a small object wrapped in dark cloth, which he unwrapped just enough to check, and Sable saw it for 1/2 of 1 second before he wrapped it again. A seal, iron-handled, the thorn crown cut into its face, the false one. Keep it on you, Lady Aldrith said, until the thing is signed. Then it goes in the fire, not before. She turned from the mirror. Now stop hovering, and someone tell that girl to hurry with the fire. We haven't got all morning. And Sable understood 2 things at once. She understood exactly where the die was. In Roderick's coat, on his person, which meant she could not simply take it. And she understood that she had at most 6 hours to get a false seal out of the coat of a trained wolf who would tear the throat from anyone who touched it. Which is impossible, said the voice that had kept her alive for 23 years. Which is completely impossible, and you should run. You should run right now while the gate's still open. She finished laying the fire. She stood. She curtsied to a room that did not see her. And she walked out with a plan that was insane and thin, and the only one she had. The tribunal convened at midday in the great hall. Sable knew because she was watching from the servants' corridor. Behind the tapestries, in the narrow passage where she had once carried wine and heard her own name called an inconvenience, the place where all of this had in a sense begun. The hall had been arranged for judgment. The long tables cleared. 3 high seats at the center for the tribunal, 1 for a Greyhold official, 1 for a lord of the Southern Holdings, 1 for a northern representative of the Alliance. The documents laid out, the false ones, the broken seals, and an empty place in the center of the floor, where the accused was meant to stand. Except the accused was gone, which was of course the entire point. A condemnation in absence. A verdict against a woman who could not speak on evidence she could not challenge, delivered fast, before the signing, before the king, could ask a single question. Lady Aldrich sat at the gallery, composed hands folded. Roderick stood near the Southern Lord, and Sable watched him. Watched the exact place on his coat, where the false dye sat against his ribs, wrapped in dark cloth, waiting for the fire. And King Aldrich sat at the head of it all. She had not seen him in 3 days, and it did something to her chest that she did not have time for the sight of him, because he did not look like a man about to sign an alliance. He looked like a man made of stone, listening to a thing being built in front of him, giving nothing away. The gray eyes flat, the scar pale along his jaw. The Southern Lord rose to speak. "The accused," he began, "a maid of no pack and no name was found in possession of altered alliance documents, hidden in her own quarters, on the eve of assigning her." "Where is she?" Aldrich's voice, low, cutting straight through the man's opening like a blade through cloth. The Southern Lord faltered. "Your Majesty, the accused. You mean to condemn her? Where is she?" "She fled, Your Majesty, in the night," which is itself an admission of, "Then you'll wait." Aldrich had not raised his voice once. "I do not condemn empty rooms. If the woman fled, she'll be found, and she'll stand where I can see her, and she'll answer. Until then, Your Majesty." And Sable stepped out from behind the tapestry, into the great hall, out of the narrow passage where the invisible people moved, into the light and the space and the eyes of every wolf lord in that room, which turned to her all at once, the way flowers turn toward a change in the light. She was still in Pell's apron, her hair still coming loose from the traveling road. 23 years of learning to disappear, and she walked into the center of that hall and made herself, for the first time in her life, deliberately and completely seen. "I didn't flee," she said. Her voice carried further than she expected, steadier than she had any right to. "I was told to run by a woman kinder than the rules she serves. And I got as far as the Eastern Hill." A breath. "And then I turned around, because a woman with nothing left to lose has nothing left to be afraid of." The hall was utterly silent. Aldrich was on his feet. She didn't know when he'd stood. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the corridor on the first day. Thorough, unhurried. Except there was something underneath it now that had not been there before. Something that had been holding very still for 3 days, and had just in the space of a heartbeat come loose. "You came back," he said. Only 3 words. But she heard underneath them everything Corwin had told her in the corridor. 4 years. A man who'd buried the last person who ever saw him as a man. And a woman who had walked out of his castle, and against every instinct 23 years had built in her, walked back in. "I came back," Sable said, "because I'm innocent, and because I can prove it. If this tribunal will let a maid speak." Lady Aldrich rose from the gallery, smooth as still water. "Your Majesty, this is precisely the theater one would expect from a 'let her speak.'" Aldrich did not look at Lady Aldrich when he said it. He looked at Sable, and Sable spoke. She did not rush. That was the thing she'd learned from him in the end. From the king who did not because volume was for men unsure of being heard. She stood in the center of the great hall, and she spoke slowly, and she let each thing land before she set down the next. "The document you say I altered carries the northern seal," she said, "the iron thorn crown, pressed in red wax. And you'll all have looked at it and seen the king's seal and thought there it is plain as day." A pause. "But I handled the king's letters. A maid who dresses lords also carries their post. And the true northern seal has a flaw. A chip in the third thorn on the left side, where the die broke years ago. Every genuine seal in the 5 territories carries that chip. She looked at the document on the table. Bring it here. Look at the third thorn, and tell me what you see. The northern representative, the Alliance's own man, reached for the document, held it up to the light, and Sable watched his face change. There's no chip, he said slowly. The thorn is whole. A murmur moved through the hall like wind through grass. Which means it isn't the king's seal, Sable said. It's a copy, cut by someone who never held the true seal close enough to see the flaw. A false die. She let that sit, and then quietly. And a false die is a real object. It exists. It's in this room, which means it can be found. And here Lady Aldrich made her mistake. Because Lady Aldrich was a careful woman and a clever one, and she had planned this down to the timing of an open gate. But she had built the whole thing on the certainty that Sable was gone, that the Maid was a piece already swept off the board. And now the piece was standing in the center of the hall, talking about a die. And for 1/2 of 1 second, Lady Aldrich's eyes moved. To her son, to Roderick, to the exact place on his coat where the false die sat against his ribs. It was nothing. A flicker. The kind of thing no one notices. Except Sable noticed everything. It was the only thing she'd ever truly known how to do. Search him, Sable said, and she pointed. Not at the documents, not at the gallery, at Roderick Aldrich. Search the Lord's coat, left side, against the ribs, wrapped in dark cloth. And the hall erupted. Roderick's hand went to his coat. A reflex, a guilty flinch he could not stop. And it was that motion, that single betraying motion, that finished him. Because, watch his hands, not his mouth, Torvald had said. And now the whole hall watched his hands. And his hands had gone to the exact place a maid had named. This is absurd, Roderick started. I will not be searched on the word of a maid, Aldrich finished. His voice had changed. It had gone very quiet, and very cold, the quiet, before the crack in the ice becomes the flood. Yes, you will. He turned to Torvald, who had stepped from the shadows along the wall. Search him. What happened next happened fast. Roderick moved. Toward the door. A trained wolf fast, desperate. And Torvald moved faster, because Torvald had been standing in the exact spot he needed to stand, because Torvald had known with that wordless certainty precisely how this would go. There was a brief, ugly scuffle, and then Torvald had Roderick's arm bent behind him, and one hand inside the man's coat, and he drew out a small object wrapped in dark cloth. He unwrapped it and held it up. An iron-handled seal, the thorn crown cut into its face, the third thorn on the left hole, and unbroken, the false die, in the hand of the man who'd sworn he'd never seen it. Pulled from the coat a maid had pointed to, in front of every lord in the 5 territories. The silence in the great hall was the loudest thing Sable had ever heard. It came apart quickly after that, the way these things do once the first thread pulls, because a false die is not a thing a man carries by accident. And a lord found with one on the morning he meant to condemn an innocent woman for a forgery he himself had made is a lord with nowhere left to stand. Roderick talked. Of course he talked. Men like that always talk once the ground goes out from under them, spilling names and details in a desperate scramble to trade his mother's guilt for his own mercy. And Lady Aldrich sat in the gallery, still composed, still smooth as water, watching her son unmake them both, and she did not say a single word, because there was nothing left to say. The plan had failed. The woman she'd swept off the board had walked back onto it and turned the whole game against her. The tribunal did not condemn Sable. The tribunal condemned the Aldrichs. The forgery, the false accusation, the attempt to seize a northern council seat by destroying the alliance they claimed to serve. The southern lord who'd risen to speak against her sat down and did not rise again. Lady Aldrich was escorted from the gallery, upright, unbroken, her face a mask, and Sable felt no triumph watching her go. Only a kind of cold, clean quiet. The quiet of a thing set right. And then, the hall began to empty. The lords filing out, murmuring the whole shape of the visit, reordered in the space of an hour, and Sable stood in the center of the floor, still in Pell's apron, and she realized she did not know what happened now, because she had planned exactly as far as "don't let them condemn you," and no further. And now the thing was done, and she was a maid standing in a great hall where a maid had no reason to be. Until Aldrich came down from the head of the room and stopped in front of her, and did the thing that Sable would carry with her, that the whole hall would carry, that would be told and retold in the servant corridors of Greyhold for a generation. King Aldrich, ruler of the 5 northern packs, the man who'd bound 3 bloodlines without a single open battle. He stood in front of a maid with no name and no pack in front of every lord still lingering in that hall, and he inclined his head. A small motion, a bow, not deep, but unmistakable. "I owe you an apology," he said. The hall went still all over again. "When they accused you, I sat in a sealed council chamber and heard nothing of it until the tribunal was called. That is the truth, and it is also not an excuse." His gray eyes did not leave hers. "I should have made it impossible for a thing like this to happen inside my sight. I should have made certain that no woman in my presence could be disappeared while I signed papers in the next room. I did not, and you nearly paid for it." A pause. "So, I'm sorry, before all of them, because you were wronged in front of all of them, and an apology whispered in a corner is no apology at all." Sable stood very still, because she had spent her whole life being the person things happened to. The one who could be moved, blamed, dismissed. The stray to be left in the mud. And in 23 years, not once, not a single time had a person with power ever stood in front of her and said, "I was wrong, and you were owed better." She had not known until that moment how badly a person could need to hear it. How long she'd been carrying the absence of it, folded up, small and invisible, like everything else. "You asked where I come from," she said, her voice not quite steady now. "Through a door I shouldn't have been listening at." Something moved in his face. "I did. I know the answer now. I didn't 3 days ago." She took a breath. "But that's a longer story, and it's mine to tell. When I choose to. Not because a king's nose caught a scent worth stopping for." And Aldrich King of the Iron Range did the thing she'd heard once through a chamber door, and once through a tapestry, and never quite seen. He smiled. Small, almost nothing, but real. "Fair," he said. "It's yours to tell, when you choose." He did not offer her a position. That was the part she understood mattered later when she turned it over in the quiet. He did not summon her or assign her or command her the way men of his standing commanded the people who moved around them. He asked, It was Corwin who came to find her first, of course, because it was always Corwin, and he found her in the east corridor with the specific expression of a man who has been dying to say something for hours. "I wants to know," Corwin said, "whether Lady Marrow would release a member of her staff to a position in the Iron Range household. A beat. Specifically, one member." "Tell him," Sable said, "that I'd want to hear it from him, not from an advisor." Corwin considered this, and then he smiled, not the practiced curl she'd first learned to read, but something smaller and more genuine. "That," he said, "is exactly the kind of answer he was hoping for." She met him that evening in the ironwood chamber. The door open, Torvald visible in the corridor beyond it. A formality she understood was for her comfort rather than propriety, and appreciated accordingly. He was standing at the narrow window when she came in, looking out at the forest, the trees dark against the last gray light. He turned when she entered and did not speak immediately, and she let the silence sit, because she'd learned by now that his silences were not empty ones. "You're not afraid of me," he said finally. "I straightened your collar," she said. "I think we established early on that my self-preservation instincts need some work." Something moved across his face, the almost laugh closer to the surface now. "I'm not offering you a position," he said. "I'm asking if you're willing to come to the Iron Range. The distinction matters to me." She looked at him a long moment, at the scar along his jaw, at the gray eyes that looked at things as they actually were, rather than as he expected them to be, at the man who'd said no in a hall full of wolves and meant it completely, and who'd bowed to a maid in front of that same hall, and who was now standing at a window asking rather than telling. "I have a condition," Sable said. He waited. "I've spent 23 years making myself invisible, because it was the only thing that kept me safe, and I'm done with it." She held his gaze. "If I come as someone who gets to be seen, who gets to speak in rooms, who gets to say when a thing is wrong out loud instead of just noticing it and folding it away. I won't go back to being a shadow behind a curtain, not even in a finer house." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "When I lost my mate," he said slowly, "everyone around me began to look at me like a thing that might break, or a thing they wanted something from. For 4 years, I was either a wound or a throne, never a man." His gray eyes held hers. "And then a maid saw a crooked collar and fixed it without wanting anything back. Do you understand what that was after 4 years to be seen as a person with something out of place instead of a king with something to give a pause? I don't want you invisible, Sable. I've had a household full of people who look through me. What I want is the one person who looked at me." The fire burned low in the hearth, the forest darkening in the window. "Yes," she said. The delegation left at dawn. Odalis walked with her to the castle gate, carrying the small cloth bag that held everything Sable owned, which was not very much, and handed it over without ceremony, because Odalis understood that ceremony would have made it harder. "You were never meant for this castle," Odalis said. "I knew it the first winter. You just needed someone with the right eyes to see it." A pause. Turns out it took a wolf king's nose, but eyes would have been my guess. Sabled her once, briefly, and then picked up her bag and walked through the gate. The Iron Range was everything the stories had described, and nothing like she'd imagined. The mountains older than anything she'd ever seen. The fortress at their center, built to outlast the memory of the people who built it. All dark stone and deep fires, and the constant smell of pine and cold air, which she came to associate over the weeks that followed with something she had not expected to feel again so completely. Safety. Not the invisible kind. Not the safety of being too small to notice. The other kind. The structural kind that isn't about the absence of danger, but about the presence of something worth standing beside. Aldrich did not rush anything. He was, as Corwin had once said, a man defined by patience. Not the passive patience of a man waiting for things to improve, but the active patience of a man who's decided what matters and is willing to move at the speed that matters requires. He gave her time. He gave her a place in the fortress that was hers and not contingent on anything. He asked her things and listened to the answers and remembered them. And when she was ready, months later, on a long evening by the fire, she told him where she came from. The healer mother. The destroyed pack. The last thread of a bloodline someone had once decided must end. And he listened to all of it, and when she finished, he said only, "Then they failed. The thread held. And that was all. And it was enough." Roderick Aldrich tried once 3 months on to contest the tribunal's ruling through a formal challenge. The Allied Pack Tribunal reviewed it for 11 days. They declined it in 4 sentences. Lady Aldrich left the southern holdings for an eastern territory, shortly after which everyone noted and no one mourned. Halden eventually stopped standing outside doors when Sable approached them, which Corwin declared a historic diplomatic achievement and commemorated by losing badly at cards to Torvald, who had apparently been betting on the timeline. Torvald said nothing about winning. He simply collected his coins with the expression of a man who'd known the outcome from the start and had merely been waiting for everyone else to arrive at it. And on the last evening of the first winter, Aldrich found her at the window of the high tower. The one that looked out over the full range of mountains, their peaks carrying the first snow of the season in the last light of the day. He stood beside her a long time without speaking, and she did not speak either, because some things do not require words, and both of them had learned by then to recognize which things those were. After a while, he said quietly, "The collar is straight." She looked at him. "It has been," she said, "for some time." He took her hand. Outside, the snow fell over the iron range, slow and certain, covering the old ground with something clean. The mountains standing exactly as they'd always stood, unchanged, unhurried, built to last. And Sable, who had spent 23 years learning to disappear, stood at a high window in a place where she was seen and known and safe. Not because she'd made herself small enough to survive, but because on a cold road under sharp stars, with nothing left to lose, she had finally turned around and walked toward the thing she feared, and let herself be seen. Inside the fire burned, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.